welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica.
I'm Megan.
Ed Stacy.
And we are here with our very special guest.
I'm Susie Tofte. I'm an archivist and the collections manager for the Jim Henson Company.
Okay, and we are very excited to have you here today. First of all, how long have you been with the archives?
I have been with the Jim Henson Company archive for almost 5 years now, although you could trace it back to 2007 when I started as an intern while I was in graduate school with the archivist here, Karen Falk. But I've been in my current role here for 5 years.
And how long has the archive been about?
The archive was established officially by Karen Falk, who is our archives director. She's been here for almost 28 years. So it started after the death of Jim Henson, a few years after he died. But there were efforts to collect things sort of more unofficially prior to that. So in Jim's lifetime, he started a journal in 1965, which we call the Red Book. And he started a written log of his activities, recorded anything that he felt worth recording as a single line in his journal. And he kept it until the end of 1988 because he was just an incredible saver of content. So he saved everything. He saved all of his sketchbooks, all of his doodles, his handwritten notes. And so he was really, in some ways an archivist himself, or he really found it important to record what he was doing in his life. But then the archive for the company started in 1992, and ever since then, we have been collecting the creative output of the company.
That's really incredible. I think as librarians, we all love the fact that he himself liked to take notes and really keep a record of what he was doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to just sort of begin. I think that you and what you all do there was on the top of our list as an archive to reach out to.
Yes.
I'm just curious.
Yes.
Why were you interested in us?
Why are we interested? That is an amazing question. We all grew up with what you've done, and what Jim Henson began, and we're librarians. We we add to a catalog of everything is kind of what I see what we do as. And the way that our philosophy for this podcast, for instance, is that you can, and I know I say this on so many of them, you can walk into a library and you can find books, movies, materials about anything that's of interest. And we're just sort of adding a new way to catalog what people might be interested in. And there is not one of us, I think, in any generation in this library who in one way or another has not been touched by Jim Henson and what he has contributed.
Oh, yeah. I'd say what recently brought back interest was talking about the Netflix series of oh my God!
The Dark Crystal,
Age of Resistance. Yeah. I say that as I'm looking at your Pop Funkos.
I have several Dark Crystal Pop Funkos. Yes,
because with that coming up and talking about Jim Henson, and then I didn't know there was an archive until I was like, oh, I should have known.
Yeah, well, the Dark Crystal is actually a really good project to bring up because it sort of gets to a lot of what our archive does and how it works as a service department for our company, because we have all of the original artwork and a lot of the paperwork, just the production files from the original Dark Crystal.
That is so cool.
And it's also, it kind of goes back to the time of when Jim was alive, and when the Dark Crystal was being produced in the late 70s and early 80s, it was all paper. All of the designs were drawn on paper. There wasn't it wasn't computer designed anything. And so we have all these, just this very rich record of how the show was produced and the designs. And as an archive, because we've scanned everything, we cataloged every piece of artwork from that production, we were able to then supply this really great reference file for the new production team when they started producing the Netflix series. And so they were able to sort of, and also, we were fortunate enough that Brian Froud, who was one of the original designers of the movie, also designed the artwork for the current production along with his son. It was really just like a wonderful way to participate in a new production and to really feel like the archive is relevant. So that like it's just like it's been a really good example. And it took years for that sort of prequel to come about, and it's had so many different ways in which we thought about trying to bring that world back to life. And the other great thing was, because the original Dark Crystal was done with all practical effects, like Jim did not use any sort of CGI to enhance his world. He created that world, and it was entirely built on sound stages. All of the puppeteers were moving. And Netflix really got on board with doing that again with this new production. I mean, they did use some CGI, but like so much of it is a practical effect, and you notice that difference when you watch that. Watch the show.
Can I ask you first? So first of all, so Brian Froud, his son Toby, that's the name, right? Yeah. He was also Toby in Labyrinth.
Yeah, he was the baby in Labyrinth.
Which
he was.
Oh, wow.
Oh, you didn't know that, Stacey?
No.
Yeah.
Learn something new every day.
But I read something, and I don't know if it's true. And then I know, is it, just because Stacey brought up Dark Crystal right off the bat, is it true that Lore was an original character that Jim Henson wanted to include in the first, when he first began?
No, Lore was a wholly new character that was developed for the new show. That I don't think is correct. The thing that was amazing about Lore is he's also a puppet. He's completely a puppet. They built him.
Oh, wow.
So he's not, yeah. But that is not true.
And then
as far as I know.
Which brings up the point, do not believe clickbait, because I read that and I was like, oh, how exciting. But
I remember talking about that.
Yes. All right. So clickbait has been disproven at the moment. So
I was just wondering, how did they determine what to use from the archives for the TV show of the Dark Crystal?
Well, it was a lot of reference material. It was like referencing. So like but like with the, and I probably can't speak as much to this as like the production team, but they did recreate a lot of the Skeksis characters, and then they added some additional ones, and obviously they had to create more Gelflings because there was only 2 left by the time the movie is made. But it was more like looking at the costuming, looking at the detailing, because there's a lot of symbols that were created, and even just like the props and sort of the Skeksis symbols. There's just so much of that world that was created the first time around, and they wanted to sort of enrich that mythology. But they created whole languages and written, kind of alphabets and such. So that was what they were looking at. And also they were looking at blueprints to look at the floors and the designs of the sets. So that's what they were looking at from the archive.
So none of the sets or the Muppets from the original Dark Crystal, were any of them repurposed, or everything was new?
No, that's a really good question. So, puppets, the puppets of the Skeksis, they're made with a material called foam latex, and it is not, it did not age well. I will put it that way. So we have some of the original, Skeksis heads, and we have some of the original Skeksis, but they would not be performable. Also because the technology has changed so much. So a lot of, just the way that the puppets were performed, if you see in the original puppets had these incredibly long, heavy cables that would come out of them, that if they were, being manipulated remotely. So just very clunky technology that has improved, and also the puppets just don't age well.
Kind of like the Skeksis.
Yeah, exactly. But and it's one of the reasons, with our archive, we have made a point to donate a lot of the puppet objects in our collections to museums, because we don't really have the bandwidth to maintain a puppet collection that's made out of foam and all these materials that really deteriorate over time. And so we've actually, the Henson family has donated hundreds and hundreds of puppets and objects to the Museum of the Moving Image, which is here in Astoria, Queens.
I was going to say that.
I saw the collection years ago, but I know it's been updated since.
I saw it a couple of years ago after I was 2 blocks over, not realizing. And it was my friend's birthday, and we're like, hey, let's go. And we literally only went to the museum to go see the Henson exhibit.
Yeah, it brings in families, it brings in school groups. It's again, like you were saying, it's so many people were touched by Jim's work, and then the work that our company has done, since his lifetime. And part of the reason why the Museum of the Moving Image is so interested in having this permanent Jim Henson collection is there was a traveling exhibit that was done, coordinated through the Smithsonian, and when it came to the Museum of the Moving Image, it was so popular, and they thought, we'd really love to be able to have, a collection of Jim's work here. So it's been really good for us because we have these museums. The Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta is another one of the museums that has a large collection, as well as the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. They have a smaller collection, but they have Jim's original puppets that he built for Sam and Friends. So they have the original Kermit, and a smaller collection of puppets, but but this is another way in which we can continue to support our mission of getting Jim's story out there in the world. And with the Museum of the Moving Image, they have the puppets, and then we supplement the exhibit with works on paper from our archive. So they also have all this wonderful moving imagery that we provide for them as well. So it creates this really rich story of having the puppet objects, and then it's rounding out his story with this other documentation.
You were talking about so many people, and this is the reoccurring theme, seemingly in this interview. So many people being touched by Jim Henson's work, and his work began in the 50s, I believe. Yep. I remember being, watching the Muppet Show on the little dial TV that my parents had in their first apartment. Well, the first apartment that I remember being in. I guess so first of all, your archives are not open to the public, but you bring out things to other museums?
That is correct, that our archive is not open to the public. I mean, it's I think other private archives that you spoke with, there can be, if there's a research request, there's a process of approval that it has to go through. But Jim's widow, Jane, after Jim died, she started the Jim Henson Legacy, which was the goal to preserve and present Jim's body of work. And so there has been many, many different initiatives to sort of keep his work alive and his life's work alive. Because in addition to the work that he created, his life story is very inspiring. And he was a creator and a dreamer, and he inspired a lot of other people with the work that he did. And so sort of once we got these permanent relationships with museums in place, that was sort of the main goal of the legacy. And there's, it's less of an active organization, but we still very much a big part of our jobs are supporting these institutions that tell the public-facing story of Jim's life. And in addition to the Center for Puppetry Arts, the Museum of the Moving Image, and the Smithsonian, the Museum of Moving Image also has a traveling exhibit currently that's going around the United States. It's currently in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And again, it's everywhere it goes, it brings in different audiences from museums, and it's a really big draw. But, again, because of the richness of our archive, we have all of this video collections that we can provide, all this video content. They can screen his films. They can do children's programming. They can have performers and various creative people who worked on these productions. They'll come out and talk. So it's just a very rich program that we're able to create around the exhibits.
That sounds really interesting. I remember as a young child, I was really inspired by the Jim Henson films, and I actually received a letter from the Jim Henson Company because of my vision.
Oh, you did?
I had to wear, so I used to watch Muppet Treasure Island, and I had to wear a patch over one of my eyes. So I sent in a little letter to them, and they actually sent me back the movie, and they were just talking about like how interesting that was, and, you know, cool that, you know, I related that to the film. So I had that from childhood, and that was really special.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really amazing. I mean, we do have fan mail that we've kept, but also the company really did take it seriously, that they had people that worked on staff who were in charge of replying to fan mail. You know, and sometimes it would just be more form letters, but like they really did have somebody who read the fan mail, and it meant something to the company.
Yes, it was really
That's
meaningful.
a really nice story.
Yes. Yeah. How do you determine what you keep in a collection at one time in the museum? Like, is it by
or the archive?
The archive.
Well, there's a curator there, Barbara Miller, who did research in our archive, and she made a lot of the selections. And then we sort of have a rotating schedule for the paper work. But one of the great things about our collection is that we have, so for example, one of the things that is on display there is storyboards that Jim drew for commercial work. So after his short show on WRC-TV in Washington, D.C., which is called Sam and Friends, he got involved with commercial work. And so he would build puppets, and they were very short, like 8-second commercials. But we have these wonderfully illustrated storyboards, but we have so many of them. And so we're able to rotate out the storyboards while sort of maintaining the same story that the curator is trying to tell at the museum. So it was selected objects that the curator picked, and then, you know, if the piece of work is in good enough condition, then we will loan it to them. So it's a process of loaning.
That's really interesting, and I love, you know, storytelling is so important, you know, to everyone coming in to see the archival pieces. Do you have a favorite piece from the collection that rotates?
Oh, I mean, I have all sorts of favorites, but I will say, like, you know, there's these iconic pieces, the hand-drawn Bert and Ernie sketches that Jim did, and the early Big Bird sketches that he did for Sesame Street that are just very, you know, you're seeing him create these iconic characters for the first time and working out sort of the contrast of Bert and Ernie. Bert's a skinny, you know, has a skinnier shape, and Ernie has this wider shape. But I also really enjoy, as an archivist, I really enjoy photographs, and I love reading photographs and sort of finding all sorts of the detail and sort of the being able to place things in a time and place. And I've had the privilege of being able to scan a lot of old, both negatives and just snapshot photographs that Jim had in his collection. And I just really like reading photographs. So I would say that. But, you know, it changes every day. It really does. Do
you have, and I know this is probably like a really difficult question, but do you have a favorite Henson production series? One of my favorite Henson productions, and this is likely because, you know, I have young children, and when they were born, my husband and I found, you know, being home with them and watching daytime TV was a little depressing. Let's find something that we could, you know, fall in love with again, that feels almost like chicken soup, you know, something that feels really good and familiar. And we began to rewatch Fraggle Rock.
Oh, yeah.
Which led me down researching it, and, you know, just that, you know, Jim Henson, like his vision for it was really, truly international. The character of Doc was played by different people depending on where it was airing. And I fell in love with just how rich and how deep it was.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I mean, it was Jim's sort of vision of how, like, while each of the sort of species of characters have their own role in their world that he created, they all were interconnected, and sort of this idea of, like, how you can live peacefully among different. You know, it's like a fun fact, too, that Fraggle Rock was the first HBO original series, which I always love that little fact, because you think of HBO now as, like, solely creating original
That's
content.
really interesting.
almost.
I would never think that.
Wow.
My mind is blown this episode.
Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, and I think that Jim, like one of the also amazing things is how much of what he produced had an international appeal. I mean, the Muppet Show was aired all over the world. Fraggle Rock had all these different international productions, and that they sort of made tweaks to the show where it was aired, like you were saying with the Doc character. But, you know, Sesame Street also had this international appeal to it, and that happened very early on in the show. Like by the first or like the second year, it was airing in foreign countries, and they were creating these specific co-productions for the country. So, you know, it says a lot that his characters kind of have this reach beyond not just, you know, what it as much as Jim's story is a very American story. You know, it really appeals to like a humanity in us. But back to your question, I actually think that Bert and Ernie sketches, when Jim and Frank Oz, who is Jim's performing partner, are performing them, are just like, they are, as an adult, I just appreciate them so much, and they make me laugh, and they're silly, and they're so off the cuff, and the way that they play off of each other and their two personalities. I would say today that would be my answer. I also really, really enjoyed the Age of Resistance, the Dark Crystal.
Yes, it was so good.
Production. It's beautiful. It was a beautiful piece of television to watch.
It was such a good narrative.
Yeah.
So Bert and Ernie, my kids, every time they watch that Here Fishy Fishy sketch, lose it all the time because it is very funny. I mean, that really holds
for
up.
all ages.
Or the constant, you know, irritation of Bert trying to go to sleep, and Ernie always, you know,
he wants a glass of water.
Keeping him awake.
He wants to talk. So, did you? How long have you been in archiving in general? How many people work at the archives?
I guess I'll start with my personal story. I majored in history as an undergrad.
Yeah. Sorry, so did I.
I worked at the ACLU as a paralegal, and down the hall there was an archive, and I sort of wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and so I started volunteering at the archive after work. And I then went to graduate school and got a master's in history with a certificate in archival studies. And while I was in graduate school, I applied for an internship to work with Karen in the Henson Archive. Unfortunately, we don't really do internships anymore, but I interned with her. And then after my graduate school work, I started working on a contractual basis as a publisher at Sesame Workshop to work on a 40th anniversary photo, like a coffee table book. And at the time, Sesame Workshop didn't really have a super well-established photo archive. So I was going through 40 years of photographs, trying to pull together content to populate this book. And I started then working as the archivist at Sesame Workshop. I worked there for about 7 years, and then I came back over to Henson and to work with Karen. So we have 4 people on our staff. There's Karen and myself in New York. And then the Jim Henson Company is primarily located now in LA. We have a production facility out there. It's the old Charlie Chaplin studio. And in LA, we have our media archives, which consists of all of our moving image and photography. And we have 2 people who work out there, but they wear many hats. And Carla Della Vedova, who's the director out there, deals with a lot of distribution. All of our current shows, like anytime anytime there's new distribution deals, she's providing all the content for that. And her colleague Shannon also does a lot with our digital asset management out there.
Very, very cool. There's a lot in archiving. It's very rich. And I think as a librarian, we catalog a lot of books. Yeah. But we catalog a lot of books. But the cool thing about archives is it's like a library of items, and it's preserving just like this history of things, and it's really just kind of a beautiful offset, subsection of library science.
Right. Absolutely. And, and I think that we all here at the Henson Archive, we take a lot of pride in the fact that we are able to, we have just such a good intellectual handle on all of our assets. And so, we're such a good service department for our whole company. I mean, we have products and we have licensing and marketing and, public relations. I mean, Karen Falk for several years had a blog called Jim Henson's Red Book, and it's called the Red Book. And she took that journal that I had mentioned earlier, but she just took each one of his one-line journal entries and she was able to flesh them out with all of the content that was in the archive, just researching production files and talking to people who had worked with him. And so it's just like, and then it was eventually published into a book, which I hope you have in your library, Imagination Illustrated. But, it's just like the ability to draw out all of these stories. And it sort of is, and I'm sure with you too, like reference is such an interesting part of our profession because I'm always curious about what other people are interested in, with the topic and the subject matter that we are caretakers of here.
Do you have a lot of people come in for reference materials?
Sometimes we will have people who are writing a book or would have that sort of request, but we do service more like through email or through phone calls. Like that's more how they will ask us a question and then we would do the research internally.
How many items do you have in the archives at one time that are like physical material, digital?
I would say, like hundreds of thousands in terms of our off-site storage and on-site.
And in terms of classifying things, you would have a digital record for also the physical item that you're able to, how does that work, the whole process of cataloging?
So for most of the artwork, we are, it started off, we would digitize on a, as needed basis. So when things were needed, we would digitize them, but there's been more of a formal effort to digitize the works on paper. And then, of course, now most of the records that we get are born digital. So even with the artwork, it's created on a computer. But in terms of our processing now, when we get batches of, if it's a paper collection, we scan the artwork. We don't always scan the documents. We'll scan scripts, we'll scan certain things in the production file that are kind of the core of it, but extraneous material, we don't scan every single piece of paper in our archives.
A good way to wrap would be you worked with the New York Public Library for, I believe, the 45th anniversary of Sesame Street, which I believe we just passed the 50th. Am I right?
I know, we did.
So that was 5 years ago. But but you worked with New York Public. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the New York Public Library and libraries in general are a really good public institution to work with, especially with Sesame Street, but even with a lot of, Henson projects. And so the New York Public Library had been they had a relationship with Sesame Workshop doing some various, having puppets appear at the main branch. And so I just approached someone there and asked if they would be interested in doing an exhibit, and especially because the Library for the Performing Arts is at Lincoln Center, which is literally right across the street from where Sesame Workshop's headquarters are. And so they were very interested in it, and we were able to work it out that we put on this exhibit that talked about sort of the performative aspects of the show. So we had things about puppetry, we had things about the music writing on Sesame Street, the music that's written, also highlighting the fact that the show is just very New York. It's New York centric. We had a lot of photography of the show in and around New York, including at Lincoln Center. So it was just it was one of the best projects that I've gotten to work on as an archivist because I got to help curate it and to just put that work out in the public sphere. But again, it was highly, highly successful for the library to have the puppets on display in their gallery. And it was a very good fit for both institutions because obviously early childhood literacy is a big part of Sesame Workshop's mission.
I really admire all the work that went into putting that display at New York Public Library that you did, because just going to the library, it's not just about books. It's you discover so many other things, and that's what really it's very interesting to see the Muppets and the puppets for the kids. That's great.
Sure.
How have things changed since the acquisition of like the Muppet properties from Disney?
Right. Well, I mean, we don't own them. We don't do anything with the characters anymore. And there was, a division of assets when we sold them to the company. But there's a lot of documentation that's still in our archive about that, just purely because it was Jim's, anything that was Jim's personal papers or whatnot, we still have. But it's a really good relationship with Disney and with Sesame Workshop, because while we still build, the Henson Company still builds the puppets for Sesame. Sesame owns their characters outright as well. So, it's a really good relationship. But we're just not producing the content anymore for the Muppets.
That's very interesting, and thank you for answering that.
So I really enjoyed talking to you. It was a nice conversation.
I really enjoyed it too. Are there any upcoming projects or archive exhibits that will be happening soon?
Sure. Well, we still have the permanent. I would say that in the New York area, the best place to come is to the Museum of the Moving Image, because that's a permanent exhibition. The Jim Henson exhibition is permanent, and there's ongoing programming there there's screenings, there's special guests. Just this past Friday, there was a panel about the Age of Resistance. There was people there talking about the production, and then there was a role-playing LARP afterwards.
That is so cool.
So I would definitely
cool.
I would keep your eye out for that in the New York area. I think that would be your best option.
We have a good relationship with them because we actually lend out passes, museum passes.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
So
your patrons can definitely. There's no additional charge for that exhibit, so they should check out a pass from the library and make a day trip of it. It'd be great.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for all that you do.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So once again, this was Jessica
and Megan
and Stacy
and
Susie,
and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.